The deadly silence that filled the corridor of Washington High School that Monday morning was the kind that comes right before a storm. The school's most rebellious students, those who had made teachers request transfers within weeks, watched through the grimy windows of room 204 as a lone figure walked across the courtyard. His military boots struck the cracked concrete with a rhythmic sound, each step echoing like a war drum no one yet knew was being played. The man carried only a worn-out backpack and a gaze that seemed to have witnessed things most people could never imagine. But his upright posture and precise movements went unnoticed by the young observers. Students who were about to learn, they had gravely underestimated their newest target. Marcus Thompson, just 28 years old, pushed open the door to the teacher's lounge with the same silent determination that had defined every mission he had completed over the past 8 years. His face, marked with barely visible scars, told stories he would never voluntarily share, while his ice-blue eyes scanned the room with the precision of someone trained to identify threats in seconds. Principal Sandra Williams watched him nervously, her hands trembling slightly as she held the dossier detailing the incidents that had driven 3 teachers to abandon the senior class in just 2 months. She had no idea she was handing that folder to a man who had faced armed Taliban fighters in Afghan caves, someone for whom troubled teenagers were a near comforting challenge. What she also didn't know was that Marcus had chosen that school, that class, for reasons that would only become clear when it was too late for anyone to change the course of events. The bell rang like a combat alarm, and Marcus walked the hallways, observing the graffiti-covered walls, broken desks, and defiant faces of students who were already positioning themselves for their first test. His years of military service had taught him to read body language like an open book, and he could instantly spot the natural leaders, the followers, and the silent watchers who preferred to stay in the shadows. Jake Morrison, with his overdeveloped muscles and poorly done tattoos, clearly ruled the territory like a teenage general, while his Lieutenant Sarah Chen organized the girls in a formation any soldier would recognize as battle prep. They didn't know they were being analyzed by someone who had planned ambushes in hostile terrain, someone who could predict their moves 3 steps ahead. The irony of seasoned soldiers underestimating civilians was familiar to Marcus, but the irony of civilians underestimating a soldier was about to become a lesson no one in that school would ever forget. When Marcus finally entered room 204, the atmosphere shifted instantly from anticipation to something much more dangerous. The 23 students in the school's most problematic class watched him with the kind of predatory interest wolves show a wounded prey, unaware they were in the presence of something far more lethal than anything they could imagine. He placed his backpack carefully on the desk, his deliberate and controlled movements catching the attention of the more observant students who noticed something different in the way he occupied the space. "Good morning. My name is Marcus Thompson," he said, in a calm voice laced with enough authority to make even Jake hesitate for a moment. "And you're about to learn that some substitutes are very different from the rest." The faint smile forming at the corner of his mouth never reached his eyes, and for a brief moment, a few students felt an unexplainable chill crawl down their spines, as if some primitive instinct warned them they had just awakened something that should have remained asleep. What happened in the first 15 minutes of class would be remembered by everyone present as the moment the silent war officially began. Jake Morrison, used to asserting dominance over every substitute teacher from day one, decided it was time to show the newcomer how things really worked in room 204. He slowly rose from his seat, his muscular arms deliberately tensed as he walked to the front of the room with the confidence of someone who had never lost a psychological battle. "Hey, substitute," he said with a malicious grin that had intimidated dozens of educators before. "How about you tell us what you actually know about teaching? Because I bet it's not much." What Jake didn't notice was that Marcus didn't flinch an inch. His eyes remained locked on the boy with the same intensity a sniper fixes on a target. And for a fraction of a second, something in Marcus's expression made Jake hesitate, as if he had accidentally poked something that should have been left alone. Marcus stayed perfectly still for 5 exact seconds, a stretch of time that felt like an eternity to everyone in the room, before taking one step forward, causing Jake to instinctively step back. "Interesting intimidation technique," Marcus said in a voice so calm it was almost hypnotic. "But you've been telegraphing your intentions through body language for at least 30 seconds. He began circling Jake with fluid, precise movements like a predator studying its prey, speaking in a conversational tone that somehow felt more threatening than any scream. Tension in the shoulders, clenched fists, forward aggressive posture, rapid nasal breathing. He listed every detail as if teaching an anatomy class. "All of that tells me you're nervous, overcompensating, and definitely not as confident as you want me to believe." The entire room watched in dead silence, realizing they were witnessing something entirely different from any confrontation they'd seen before. Something that made the air feel heavier, charged with a tension none of them could quite name. Sarah Chen, noticing Jake losing ground in a way she had never seen, stepped in with her most effective weapon: social humiliation. "Wow, how impressive," she said with venomous sarcasm as she rose from her desk. "The sub read a few psychology books and thinks he knows us." She strolled through the room, drawing visual support from other students with the mastery of someone who had orchestrated countless social intimidation campaigns. "I bet you'll last, 2 weeks before running off like all the others," she continued, her voice growing in confidence as she sensed control returning to her hands. "Because scared substitute teacher is exactly what you look like." Marcus turned to her with a movement so smooth it could have been a dance, but there was something in his eyes that made Sarah freeze mid-sentence, something that made her realize she had just made a miscalculation that could carry consequences far more serious than anything she'd faced before. Marcus's response came in the form of silence so long that a few students began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. He didn't say a word, just stared at Sarah with an intensity that made the room feel colder, his eyes unblinking, unwavering, and betraying no hint that her words had touched him emotionally. When he finally spoke, it was in a voice so low everyone had to lean forward to hear it. 2 weeks is an interesting time frame, Sarah." The way he said her name, as if he already knew details about her life she had never shared, sent a chill down her spine. "Let's make a deal," he continued, slowly walking back to his desk. "If I'm still here in 2 weeks, you'll find out exactly what kind of teacher I really am." The smile that formed on his face this time was different from before, more calculated, more dangerous, and it carried the promise that the next 14 days would be far more interesting than anyone in room 204 could possibly imagine. What began as subtle psychological tests quickly transformed into a coordinated terror campaign that would have broken any ordinary teacher in a matter of hours. Jake Morrison, wounded in his pride by Marcus's display of control in the previous class, had spent the entire night planning a series of humiliations designed to force the substitute to request a transfer before the week was out. He arrived the next morning with cold determination in his eyes and a bag full of surprises he had used to psychologically torture his previous targets, unaware that he was preparing for a war against someone who had faced real combat against terrorists. The first trap was simple yet effective: super strong glue spread on Marcus's chair, a juvenile tactic that had worked perfectly on the previous 3 teachers. But when Marcus entered the room and immediately noticed the shiny substance on the seat, he simply smiled and stood throughout the entire class, as if standing for hours was the most natural thing in the world, leaving Jake with the unsettling feeling that his childish tactics were utterly ineffective against this mysterious man. The second phase of the attack came during history class, when Sarah Chen decided it was time to use her specialty, public humiliation through impossible questions. "Mr. Thompson," she said with feigned innocence as she raised her hand, "since you're just a substitute, I bet you don't even know the basics of the Civil War." She had prepared a series of extremely specific questions about obscure battles, precise dates, and military strategies that she had memorized specifically for this moment, expecting to see the man stammer and humiliate himself in front of the whole class. But something strange happened when Marcus began to answer. Not only did he know every detail she had asked about, he started describing battle tactics with a precision and intensity that rendered the entire room silent. "The Battle of Gettysburg," he said, his eyes taking on a distant and dangerous quality, "was decided not solely by strategy, but by men who understood that sometimes you have to be willing to do things others wouldn't in order to protect what matters." The way he spoke of war, as if he were reciting personal memories rather than historical facts, made several students exchange nervous glances, beginning to suspect that there was something much deeper and more dangerous in this man's history than they had initially imagined. The third attack was the most brutal and coordinated, a degradation campaign that began with offensive graffiti on Marcus's desk and escalated to planned accidents. Tommy Rodriguez, one of Jake's most loyal followers, was instructed to knock a bottle of soda over onto Marcus's backpack during recess, hoping to destroy any personal materials the teacher might have brought. But when the backpack was accidentally opened amidst the chaos, what they saw made them freeze instantly. Inside were items that definitely did not belong to an ordinary teacher. Military medals, photographs of men in combat uniforms set against arid landscapes, and a small notebook filled with coded notes that appeared more appropriate for a war manual than for lesson plans. Tommy quickly shut the backpack and pretended not to have seen anything. Yet the seed of doubt was planted, and he couldn't stop thinking about the expression in the eyes of the men in the photographs. Men who seemed to have seen and done things that could only be born of nightmares. The accidental revelation made Tommy realize that they were not just dealing with an ordinary substitute teacher, but with someone who harbored secrets that could be far more dangerous than anything they had ever encountered. Marcus observed every movement, every whispered word, every exchanged glance, with the patience of a predator who knows his prey is slowly approaching the trap. He did not react to the provocations, demonstrated neither anger nor frustration, and certainly showed no sign of being affected by the campaign of intimidation that had destroyed his predecessors. Instead, he continued his lessons with an almost supernatural calm, occasionally making comments that appeared innocuous on the surface but carried layers of meaning that made some students feel deeply uncomfortable. "It's interesting how some people mistake silence for weakness," he remarked casually as he erased the board, when in fact, the most dangerous people I've ever known were those who spoke less and observed more. His voice maintained the same conversational tone as always, but there was something in the way he pronounced certain words that made the air in the room feel heavier, charged with unspoken possibilities. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, Marcus smiled at the class with an expression that could not completely hide the promise that the real lesson was yet to come, and that when it arrived, it would be an experience none of them would ever forget. On Thursday morning, Principal Sandra Williams sat at her desk with a cup of cold coffee in hand and an expression of mounting despair on her face, surrounded by incident reports that resembled a horror movie script more than school documents. 3 substitute teachers in 2 months, all requesting transfers with tearful goodbyes and promises never to return to Washington High. And now she had bet everything on Marcus Thompson, a man she'd known for less than a week. The phone rang for the 5th time that morning. Another call from furious parents complaining about their children's behavior, about nightmares and strange personality changes they couldn't explain. "My daughter came home yesterday saying that the substitute teacher made her feel as if he could read her mind," one mother had screamed on the phone. "What kind of man did you hire?" Sandra hung up and looked out the window of her office at the schoolyard, where Marcus walked alone during recess, his upright posture and precise movements standing in stark contrast with the surrounding adolescent chaos. And for the first time since assuming the role of principal, she wondered if she had made a mistake that might have consequences far beyond her understanding. The emergency meeting that Sandra convened with school counselor Dr. Peterson and Vice Principal Mr. Rodriguez on Thursday afternoon was marked by a level of tension none of them had experienced before. "There's something different about him," Dr. Peterson said, while flipping through his notes on the strange behaviors he was observing among the students in room 204. "The reports I'm receiving don't match any normal pattern of adjustment to a new teacher." He described how students who were normally disrespectful and defiant were coming to his office with vague complaints about feeling watched and analyzed in ways that made them question their own motivations. "Jake Morrison came to see me yesterday," Dr. Peterson continued in a lowered whisper, "and said he feels as though Mr. Thompson can predict every move he's about to make before he even thinks about doing it." Mr. Rodriguez shook his head in concern, recalling his own interaction with Marcus in the teacher's lounge, where the substitute had greeted every staff member with a handshake so firm it seemed to measure exactly how much pressure was necessary to convey respect without asserting dominance. The meeting ended without any concrete resolutions, but with a unanimous decision that Marcus Thompson needed to be observed more closely, a decision that would prove both wise and utterly inadequate for dealing with what was truly unfolding. The attempt at direct intervention came on Friday, when Sandra decided it was time for an honest conversation with Marcus about his unconventional teaching techniques. She called him into her office during lunchtime, prepared for a professional discussion on appropriate boundaries between teachers and students, completely unaware that she was about to sit in front of someone trained to withstand interrogations by specialized military forces. "Marcus," she began, trying to maintain an authoritative yet friendly tone, "I've received some concerns about your teaching methods, and I'd like to better understand your approach with the students." Marcus sat in the chair across from her desk with a posture that was both relaxed and alert, his eyes never leaving her face as he responded with his own questions that subtly turned the conversation back on her. "What specific concerns, Sandra?" he asked, using her first name in a manner that was technically respectful, yet made her feel as if she were being evaluated rather than conducting an evaluation. Over the next 45 minutes, Sandra discovered that every question she asked was skillfully deflected back to her. Every attempt to establish authority was subtly neutralized, and by the end of the conversation, she felt as though she had been the one being interrogated, leaving her office with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that she had gravely underestimated the man she had hired. The administration's frustration reached its peak when they realized they had absolutely no real power over Marcus Thompson, not because he was openly defying their authority, but because he was following every rule, every protocol, every guideline with such precision that it was impossible to find fault in his conduct. His lesson plans were impeccable, his assessments fair and well documented, his interactions with other staff were professional and respectful, and technically, he was doing nothing more than teaching history in a way that clearly worked. The students of room 204 were no longer causing disturbances, they were no longer being sent to the principal's office, and for the first time in years, their grades were actually beginning to improve. "It's as if he were playing an entirely different game from the rest of us," Sandra confessed to Dr. Peterson the following Monday, "and the rules of that game are rules we don't even know exist." What she didn't know was that Marcus was indeed playing a different game, a game he had learned in military training fields and perfected in missions where failure meant death, and that the true match was only just beginning. The school administration had completely lost control of the situation without even realizing that a silent war was being waged right under their noses, and that the outcome of that war would determine not only the future of room 204, but possibly the future of everyone involved. What disturbed the students of room 204 the most wasn't the anger or frustration they expected to see in Marcus Thompson after 2 weeks of systematic psychological torture, but the absolutely unshakable calm he demonstrated in the face of every provocation, every insult, every attempt at humiliation. On Monday of the third week, Jake Morrison orchestrated his most elaborate campaign of terror yet. Obscene graffiti about Marcus's family spread throughout the school, malicious rumors about his past planted in the hallways, and a series of planned accidents that included soaked textbooks, food thrown across his desk, and even a small fire in the classroom trash bin. Any normal person would have snapped, screamed, cursed, or at least shown some visible sign of stress. But Marcus simply cleaned up every mess with methodical precision, like a soldier going through a standard maintenance drill. His eyes never showed anger, only constant and calculated observation that made Jake feel like an insect being studied under a microscope. "Why doesn't he react?" Jake whispered to Tommy Rodriguez after yet another failed attempt to provoke him was met with nothing but a silent nod. "This isn't normal, man. Normal people get mad when you push them." What Jake didn't understand was that Marcus had faced situations where staying calm was a matter of life and death. And compared to hostile interrogations and real combat, teenage intimidation was almost comforting in its predictability. The most striking display of Marcus's supernatural composure came during an incident that should have broken anyone else. Sarah Chen, frustrated by the lack of reaction to her verbal provocations, escalated to physical humiliation during Friday's class. She had prepared a mixture of glue and paint, planning to accidentally spill it on Marcus's back while he wrote on the board, a tactic that had driven 2 previous substitutes out of the school in tears. As she approached him with the mixture in hand, Marcus kept writing as if unaware, but just as she raised her arm to strike, he turned with a movement so quick and fluid that Sarah didn't even have time to react. "Careful with that," he said calmly, holding her wrist with a gentleness that was somehow more intimidating than any show of strength. The pressure of his fingers was just enough to immobilize her without pain, but the precision of his movement and the way he had anticipated her attack made the entire class realize they were dealing with someone whose skills extended far beyond the classroom. Sarah froze, staring into Marcus's eyes and seeing something that made her realize she had just crossed a line she didn't even know existed, a line that separated schoolyard pranks from something far more serious and potentially dangerous. The event that truly revealed the depth of Marcus's calm occurred the following Monday when the bullying campaign reached its peak. Jake had assembled a group of 8 students for a mission he called Operation Break the Substitute, a coordinated assault involving mass vandalism, destruction of Marcus's personal belongings, and aggressive verbal confrontations designed to provoke an emotional reaction in front of the whole class. They arrived an hour before school and turned room 204 into a battlefield, flipped desks, vulgar insults on the whiteboard, and Marcus's belongings scattered on the floor in an open display of utter disrespect. When Marcus entered the room and saw the destruction, the students positioned themselves strategically, ready to film his breakdown and post it online as their final trophy. Instead, Marcus stopped at the doorway, scanned the room for precisely 15 seconds, and then began to clean, calmly, methodically, restoring each desk with the same precision a soldier uses when assembling a rifle. No yelling, no threats, not even a sigh of frustration. Just a man executing a task with robotic efficiency, someone who had long since learned that emotional control meant the difference between life and death. The class's reaction to Marcus's unshakable calm began to shift subtly from cruel amusement to something closer to genuine fear. "There's something seriously wrong with this guy," Tommy Rodriguez whispered to his friends during lunch. "Normal people don't react like this when you go after them. They get mad, they yell, they do something." Several students began noticing small details they had previously ignored. The way Marcus always knew exactly where everyone was without ever looking directly at them. How he could predict questions and interruptions before they happened. How his voice never changed tone no matter what chaos surrounded him. "It's like he's constantly analyzing everything," Sarah said during a nervous conversation with her friends. Not just what we're doing, but what we're going to do next. And then the growing realization that Marcus wasn't just resisting their attacks, but actively studying them, began to create a thick atmosphere of paranoia in room 204. Students started to question whether their intimidation tactics were truly failing, or if Marcus was allowing them to continue for reasons they couldn't yet comprehend. And that uncertainty began to corrode the confidence they had built over years of unchecked dominance over authority figures. Marcus's calm wasn't just a shield, it was a psychological weapon, slowly turning the predators into prey. And none of them were prepared for the role reversal that was happening so gradually. They'd only recognize it when it was too late to turn back. Jake Morrison's completely misguided interpretation of Marcus's calm as weakness led him to make the decision that would change everything. During a secret meeting in the school parking lot on Tuesday morning, Jake gathered his closest followers and declared total war against the substitute teacher who had disrespected his authority for far too long. "You saw how he doesn't react when we hit him," Jake said, a dangerous confidence gleaming in his eyes. "He's just another weak teacher afraid of us. It's time we show the whole school what happens when someone tries to ignore us." He planned an escalation that included direct physical intimidation, destruction of personal property, and a public humiliation so brutal Marcus would have no choice but to leave the school, or face consequences Jake believed he was too cowardly to endure. What Jake didn't realize was that his interpretation of Marcus's passivity was the exact opposite of the truth, and that every day of inaction had in fact been a masterclass in tactical reconnaissance. Marcus had been mapping every personality, every weakness, every psychological pressure point of his opponents. Jake's decision to mistake strategic patience for cowardice was about to trigger a chain of events that would reveal just how dangerous it is to underestimate someone who learned the art of war in real battlefields. The first phase of Jake's intensified offensive was a psychological terror campaign specifically designed to break Marcus through calculated personal attacks. Through online digging, they discovered that Marcus had no immediate family listed on any social network, no public relationship history, and no normal digital footprint like most people his age. A profile Jake interpreted as a sign of isolation and vulnerability. "We hit him where it hurts," he told his crew. "We make him feel so alone and useless, he'll beg to get out of here." The campaign included cruel notes left on his desk about loneliness and failure, rumors about his non-existent personal life, and a series of jokes designed to highlight his apparent lack of social ties. For an entire week, they bombarded Marcus with constant reminders that he was an outsider, someone who didn't belong and never would. But every personal attack was met with the same calm, calculating gaze that had defined all of Marcus's previous interactions. Jake started to feel like he was shooting at a target that absorbed every hit without showing a single crack. What he didn't know was that Marcus had survived the isolation of solo missions in hostile military territory, where loneliness was a survival tool, not a weakness. And Jake's attacks were actually feeding Marcus valuable intel on the attacker's own fears and vulnerabilities. The escalation reached its most dangerous point when Jake decided it was time for direct physical intimidation, a decision that would turn out to be the biggest mistake of his life. During Thursday's class, he staged a show of force involving a coordinated physical encirclement of Marcus as he tried to teach, a tactic that had scared off previous teachers. Jake stood directly in front of Marcus's desk, with Tommy and two others flanking the sides, creating a formation that blocked any clear exit path. "Hey, Thompson," Jake said in a low, threatening voice. "I think it's time you and I had a serious conversation about respect." He leaned forward, invading Marcus's personal space, hoping to spot some sign of fear or discomfort to confirm his theory that the substitute was weak at his core. But Marcus didn't move. He remained perfectly still, eyes locked on Jake's face with an intensity that made the teen realize, for the first time, that something was deeply wrong with how this man processed threats. The total absence of fear, the lack of normal defensive reflexes, and the way Marcus seemed to be evaluating him, like he was calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to neutralize him, made Jake feel he had just crossed into territory far more serious and irreversible than schoolyard bullying. Everything changed when Jake, frustrated by Marcus's lack of reaction, lightly shoved him in the chest, a final act of dominance. The contact lasted less than a second, but it was enough to awaken something in Marcus that had been tightly contained for weeks. In that microscopic instant, Jake saw something in Marcus's eyes that terrified him, something inhuman, forged through experiences that turned people into living weapons. Marcus didn't visibly react, but the energy in the room shifted instantly, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees and the air itself had thickened with pressure. "Interesting," Marcus said in the same calm voice he always used, except now there was an undertone that triggered every student's primal survival instincts. "You just did something that people far more dangerous than you have tried with me before," he continued, still motionless, still unfazed. "And I'm curious to see if you understand the implications of what you've just done." Jake instinctively stepped back, his confidence evaporating like water in the desert, realizing that he had awakened something that had been kept under control for reasons far beyond his adolescent comprehension. The smile that formed on Marcus's face this time was different from all the ones before, carrying a promise that the real education was about to begin, and that the next lessons would be taught by someone who had learned to teach, using methods none of them imagined existed outside their darkest nightmares. What happened on Friday morning would forever alter the way everyone at Washington High School understood the concept of authority and true power. Tommy Rodriguez, still haunted by what he had seen in Marcus's eyes during the previous day's confrontation, had spent the entire night obsessively researching any available information about their substitute teacher. At 3 a.m., and after hours of digging through public records, archived newspaper articles, and accessible military databases, he finally found something that made his blood run cold. Marcus Thompson wasn't just a former soldier. He was a decorated Special Forces veteran with 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 Bronze Stars for valor in combat, and a service history that included classified missions with casualty rates that made standard war statistics look like child's play. The photographs Tommy uncovered showed a man who looked 10 years older than the teacher they knew, with eyes that had witnessed horrors most people couldn't begin to comprehend. His service history made it clear why 3 weeks of high school bullying had been treated as a minor inconvenience. "Oh my God," Tommy whispered at his screen. "We've been provoking someone who's killed with his bare hands, someone trained to resist torture and survive situations that would kill normal people." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Every moment of weakness they'd interpreted was actually an act of life-saving self-control. For weeks, they had been playing with something that could have destroyed them without breaking a sweat. Tommy's decision to share his discovery with Jake and Sarah the next morning was driven by genuine fear that they were about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "You don't understand," he said with a trembling voice, showing them the articles and photos he'd found. "This guy isn't just some substitute teacher. He's a decorated war veteran who's probably seen and done things we can't even imagine." The evidence was undeniable. Pictures of Marcus in full military gear, newspaper articles about his unit receiving honors for particularly dangerous missions, and service records detailing expertise in urban combat, interrogation resistance, and survival tactics in hostile territory. Jake stared at the images, his expression shifting slowly from disbelief to genuine horror, realizing the man he had shoved the day before had survived Taliban ambushes, hand-to-hand combat with terrorists, and scenarios where life or death came down to split-second decisions. "That explains everything," Sarah whispered, remembering how Marcus had anticipated her attack with the paint, how he always knew where every student was without looking, and how his calm had been so unshakable under pressure. The revelation instantly reframed their perception of Marcus, from a passive, weak teacher to something far more terrifying. A professional predator who had chosen not to destroy them and whose patience could only be explained by someone who knew exactly when to strike. The understanding of Marcus's true identity spread through room 204 like a virus, transforming the power dynamic in ways none of the students had ever experienced before. Those who had spent weeks feeling superior and in control now realized they had been in the presence of someone who embodied a level of danger they had no vocabulary to describe. The pranks that once seemed harmless and fun now took on a horrifying new meaning when recontextualized through the lens of knowing their target had survived daily assassination attempts. "Do you realize what this means?" One of Sarah's friends whispered in the girls' bathroom. "It means he could have hurt us seriously at any moment, and he just chose not to." A reverse paranoia began to creep in as students questioned not just their past actions, but their future ones, realizing they were dealing with someone who possessed skills and knowledge far beyond anything they could comprehend or counter. The fear that started to spread wasn't schoolyard fear of detention or getting caught. It was primal, instinctual. The fear of prey, realizing they had been toying with a predator who had simply chosen not to hunt and who could revoke that choice at any moment. The moment of truth came when Marcus walked into room 204 on Friday morning and immediately sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The students who had openly defied him for weeks now avoided eye contact. Their body language changed from confrontational to defensive, and the tension in the room had spiked to a palpable level. Marcus scanned the classroom with his trained eyes and immediately recognized the signs. Someone had uncovered information about his past, and that discovery had completely altered the balance of power he had been carefully maintaining. "Interesting," he said calmly as he set his bag down on the desk. "Looks like you've learned something new about me." The silence that followed was so deep that the sound of a page turning echoed like a gunshot. Marcus smiled, his expression a mix of approval and, perhaps, relief, as if he had been waiting for this moment since day one. "Now that you know who I really am," he continued, his voice retaining its calm tone, but now layered with an authority that made every student in the room sit up straighter. "We can finally have an honest conversation about respect, discipline, and what it truly means to face someone trained to deal with threats far more serious than anything you could ever imagine." The revelation had changed the rules of the game in ways none of them had anticipated, and Marcus was clearly prepared to teach lessons that went far beyond anything found in a standard history textbook. What Marcus Thompson implemented the following Monday was not a conventional history lesson, but a precise demonstration of how a Special Forces veteran establishes total control over a hostile environment using nothing but psychology and strategic positioning. He walked into room 204 with a presence the students immediately recognized as something far beyond anything they had experienced before. Not the passive, observant substitute teacher, but something that reminded them of the military documentaries some had watched on TV. "Today, we're studying the psychology of warfare," Marcus announced as he walked the perimeter of the classroom with movements they now recognized as tactical patrol. "And you're going to learn how real soldiers deal with enemies who underestimate their capabilities." He stopped directly in front of Jake's desk, standing in a way that blocked any escape route and forced the teenager to look up at him from a psychologically submissive position. "The first lesson I learned on the battlefield," Marcus continued, his voice now carrying an authority that made the whole room sit at attention, "is that dangerous enemies rarely announce themselves. They watch, analyze, and strike when you least expect it." The smile that formed on his face was the same one they'd seen during previous weeks, but now they understood it wasn't a smile of nervousness. It was the smile of a predator who had finally chosen to reveal his true capabilities. The first application of military tactics came when Marcus began using psychological interrogation techniques he had mastered in specialized training to break down the cohesion of the group that had targeted him. "Jake," he said, positioning himself so that his shadow fell directly over the teen's desk, "I'd like you to explain to the class the difference between real courage and juvenile bravado." The question was posed conversationally, but the way Marcus made it sound like a military command left Jake with no good answer that didn't make him look weak. When Jake tried to shrug it off, Marcus simply waited in silence, using a tactic designed to make prisoners fill the void with unintended confessions. "The difference," Marcus finally said after 30 seconds of uncomfortable silence, "is that courageous people face real consequences for their actions, while those who make bravado attacks choose targets they believe to be defenseless." He then moved on to the next target with surgical precision, turning to Tommy with a question about loyalty designed to force him to choose between defending Jake or saving himself. "Tommy, would you say that following someone who clearly doesn't understand the consequences of their actions is a sign of loyalty or mental weakness?" The question was carefully constructed to create fractures in the social hierarchy that had fueled the bullies' dominance. Using psychological tools developed for dismantling terrorist cells far more organized than any teenage clique. The psychological escalation reached its peak when Marcus decided to show exactly what it meant to be analyzed by someone trained in behavioral reading and psychological manipulation. "Sarah," he said, moving behind her desk in a way that made her feel boxed in, "over the past 3 weeks, you've exhibited behavioral patterns that are fascinating from a military perspective." He began listing observations so precise and intimate, Sarah realized she had been studied like a lab specimen since day one. "You use social aggression to mask insecurity about your position in the group. You constantly test boundaries to confirm hierarchies, and you escalate confrontations when you sense you're losing control." Each point was delivered with the clinical precision of a military report, turning what Sarah thought were private thoughts into data catalogued by someone trained in psychological warfare. "What's most interesting," Marcus continued, "is that these patterns are identical to insurgents I've observed, combatants who used intimidation to maintain territorial control. And do you know what happened to most of them in the end?" The question hung in the air, like an unspoken threat, not of physical violence, but something far more devastating, the promise that Marcus possessed the knowledge and tools to destroy not just their bodies, but their psychological identities in ways they never knew were possible. The final blow in Marcus's psychological campaign came when he revealed that he had been gathering intelligence on each student, information far beyond what any normal teacher would possess. "You think you've been attacking me for the past 3 weeks, he said, returning to the front of the room and adopting a posture that radiated absolute authority. "But in reality, you've been feeding me detailed information about your personalities, fears, insecurities, and social structures." He opened a small notebook he had kept in his backpack and began reading observations that made every student feel like their minds had been invaded. "Jake Morrison leads through intimidation because he fears abandonment, likely due to childhood trauma. Sarah Chen uses cruelty to maintain social relevance because she equates attention with self-worth. Tommy Rodriguez follows orders without question to avoid responsibility for his own choices." Each psychological profile was so accurate that it left the students stunned, realizing they had been watched, analyzed, and dissected by someone who understood them better than they understood themselves. "This is what real soldiers do," Marcus concluded, closing the notebook with a final deliberate motion. "We observe, we analyze, and we develop strategies to neutralize threats using their own weaknesses." Bill, the revelation that he had spent weeks building personalized psychological weapons against each of them completely shifted the classroom dynamic. They now realized they had been playing a game where only one side knew the rules, and those rules had been written by someone who had learned to win wars using methods they didn't even know existed. What happened on the following Tuesday would be remembered as the day Marcus Thompson finally revealed why he had specifically chosen Washington High School, and the most problematic class within it, as the place for his transition from military to civilian life. Room 204 was immersed in a tense silence when he entered carrying a cardboard box that the students immediately sensed was unlike any other teaching material they'd seen before. His deliberate movements and solemn expression suggested something fundamental was about to shift. "Today," Marcus began as he placed the box on his desk, "you're going to learn about the real consequences of war and why I chose to be here, in this room, with all of you." He opened the box slowly, revealing photographs, military medals, and documents that told the story of his final mission in Afghanistan, an operation that ended with the death of 3 innocent civilians due to faulty intel and decisions made by higher-ups who had never set foot on the battlefield. The gravity of the moment transformed the atmosphere instantly. Everyone in the room could feel that what they were about to witness would fundamentally change not just their understanding of Marcus, but of power, choice, and responsibility. "You've spent weeks trying to break me," he continued, his voice holding a vulnerability none of them had heard before. "But I was already broken when I came here. I chose this school because I believed that teaching young people might help me turn what I learned in war into something constructive rather than destructive." The most shocking revelation came when Marcus explained that he had deliberately chosen to work with troubled students because he saw in them the same behavioral patterns he'd seen in young soldiers sent into combat without adequate preparation for the psychological toll of war. "Jake, when you pushed me last week, my first instinct was to calculate exactly how I'd break your arm if you were a real threat," Marcus said, locking eyes with the teen. "But then I realized you were doing exactly what I used to do at your age, using aggression to mask fear and insecurity." He pulled out a photo of himself at 18, wearing basic military gear, and the resemblance to Jake was striking, not just physically, but in the defensive bravado on both their faces. "The difference," Marcus continued now with the heavy weight of guilt in his voice, "is that when I made prideful, impulsive mistakes, people died. He had come here," he said, hoping that if he could teach kids like them to understand the real consequences of their actions before it was too late, he might find some form of redemption for the mistakes that haunted his past. The confession shattered the classroom's dynamic, students realizing they hadn't been attacking an enemy, but someone who saw in them reflections of his lost youth and had been trying to save them from the same fate that had nearly destroyed him. Tommy Rodriguez felt his eyes sting with tears as he realized the weeks of torment they had inflicted had been endured by someone who interpreted them as disguised cries for help. Each provocation seen not as an attack, but as an opportunity to teach life-saving lessons. The most powerful moment came when Marcus pulled out a letter, one he had carried with him every day, written by the mother of a soldier who died under his command. "Dear Sergeant Thompson," he read aloud, his voice trembling slightly, "my son wrote to me about you in his last letter. He said you were the first superior who truly cared about teaching them how to survive, not just follow orders. I know his death wasn't your fault, but I want you to know that he died respecting you. I hope you find a way to use what he admired in you to help others make better choices than we did." The silence that followed was almost sacred in its weight. Every student suddenly grasped that they had been in the presence of a man carrying burdens far beyond their adolescent comprehension. Sarah Chen felt her heart break as she realized her cruelty had been directed at someone trying to honor the memory of fallen soldiers by being the mentor he had failed to be for them. "You want to know why I never fought back?" Marcus asked, scanning the room. "Because each of you reminded me of those young men, and I would rather die than fail you the way I failed them." The declaration hit like an emotional shockwave. The class finally understood that their battle against Marcus had actually been a war waged against someone desperately trying to save them from destinies they didn't even know they were risking. And each act of resistance had been a missed opportunity to learn from a man who had paid the ultimate price for the wisdom he was offering. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was immediate and irreversible. For the first time, the students understood that Marcus Thompson wasn't their enemy. He was their protector, someone who had endured weeks of abuse because he saw their actions not as crimes, but as symptoms of wounds that needed healing. Jake Morrison, who had led the bullying campaign, felt a shame so deep it shattered the identity he had built. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice cracking, revealing the scared child behind the tough facade. "I didn't know. I thought you were weak, but you're the strongest person I've ever met." Jake's confession broke the emotional floodgates that had been sealed shut for years by defensiveness and pride. The rest of the class realized they had been given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to learn from someone who had faced the worst consequences of pride and impulse and was offering them this knowledge without judgment or punishment. Marcus looked at Jake with a mix of forgiveness and pride, realizing that the most important lesson had finally been learned, that true strength lies not in the ability to harm, but in the choice to use one's power to protect, even when others don't deserve that protection. "Now you understand," he said quietly, "that the real test of character isn't what you do when you have power over others, but how you choose to use that power to make the world better for those who come after you." What happened in the weeks following Marcus's revelation would be remembered as one of the most profound and lasting transformations in Washington High School's history. It started in room 204, but spread like ripples across the entire campus. Jake Morrison, who had spent years building his identity around intimidation and dominance, began using his social influence to protect younger students rather than torment them, applying the lessons of true leadership that Marcus had taught not through sermons, but by example. Sarah Chen channeled her sharp social intelligence to organize support groups for students experiencing bullying, discovering that using her gifts to heal rather than hurt gave her a sense of purpose she'd never found in cruelty. Tommy Rodriguez, inspired by Marcus's courage to face his past, began keeping a journal where he recorded not only his thoughts and feelings, but the lessons he was learning about responsibility and making choices rooted in values, not impulse. The transformation wasn't instant or easy, but it was real. It was driven by the realization that they had been given a second chance by someone who understood better than anyone the true value of redemption and personal growth. Marcus watched these changes unfold with a quiet satisfaction that only comes from seeing young people discover their true potential, knowing that enduring their abuse had been worth it if even one of them chose a better path than he had at their age. The most significant shift came when room 204 began functioning for the first time as a cohesive unit, applying teamwork and mutual support principles that Marcus had adapted from military tactics for civilian life. They began defending one another from bullying in other classrooms, collaborating on academic projects with a level of efficiency that impressed other teachers, and displaying discipline and focus that transformed their reputation from problem class to model class in a matter of weeks. It's like they finally understand that real strength is about lifting others up, not tearing them down, Principal Sandra Williams observed during a staff meeting. And it all happened because someone finally saw them as people with potential, not problems to be fixed. Marcus had implemented a mentorship system in which older students worked with younger ones, creating a support network that expanded beyond room 204 and began influencing the entire school culture. The program was so effective that other schools in the district asked Marcus to share his methods, unaware that his methods were simply leadership principles forged in war and repurposed for education, that real leaders create other leaders, that discipline comes from purpose, not punishment, and that people respond to genuine respect in ways coercion never could. The irony of a war veteran becoming the school's most effective educator wasn't lost on Marcus. He began to realize that his military experiences, despite their traumatic consequences, had prepared him for something far more meaningful than any battlefield mission. The most emotional moment of this transformation came during a school assembly where Jake, Sarah, and Tommy gave a presentation on bullying and its consequences, using their own experiences as a living testimony to how people can change when they are confronted with the truth. "We used to think bullying made us strong," Jake told an audience of hundreds of students, "but we've learned that true strength comes from protecting those who can't protect themselves. Hurting others is actually the weakest thing you can do." Sarah followed, explaining how Marcus had shown them that real respect is earned through consistent action, not fear, and that leadership through example is far more powerful than intimidation. Tommy concluded by sharing how learning about Marcus's war experiences helped them realize that all actions have consequences, and those who make prideful, impulsive choices often end up hurting not only others, but themselves in ways that last a lifetime. The presentation received a standing ovation, but more important than applause was the turning point it represented. Students who had once been the problem had become the solution, using their past mistakes to educate others and prevent the cycle from repeating. Marcus watched from the back of the auditorium with tears in his eyes, realizing he had finally found a way to honor the memory of the soldiers he'd lost, by turning his pain into something that could guide and protect others before it was too late for them to learn what he had learned at such a high cost. Marcus Thompson's journey at Washington High School came to a close at the end of the semester, when he was offered a permanent teaching position and appointed as the coordinator of a district-wide pilot mentorship program. The offer represented not just professional recognition, but a chance to build a legacy that honored both the fallen soldiers he had once led and the young lives he had helped transform. "You gave me something I didn't know I was searching for," he told Room 204 on the final day of the semester. "You gave me the chance to discover that my worst experiences could be turned into tools for creating something good in the world." The farewell was emotional, but it wasn't a goodbye. Marcus would remain at the school, and the students knew they hadn't just gained a teacher, they had found a mentor who would always be there when they needed guidance or support. Jake, Sarah, and Tommy approached him after class, each expressing gratitude not just for the academic lessons, but for the life lessons they had received from someone who had turned trauma into wisdom and pain into purpose. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, her voice carrying a maturity she hadn't possessed months earlier, "thank you for not giving up on us when we deserved it, and for showing us that it's always possible to choose to be better than we were the day before." Marcus smiled with a look that blended paternal pride with quiet fulfillment, realizing he had finally found his true calling, guiding young people who were lost down the same dangerous paths he had once walked, and using his experience to lead them toward futures defined not by rage or regret, but by purpose, integrity, and strength of character. What had begun as the story of a broken war veteran seeking redemption had become a saga of mutual transformation, where both teacher and students discovered that life's hardest lessons could become the most powerful tools for change. True strength, they had all learned, doesn't come from the power to destroy, but from the courage to protect, to educate, and to elevate others, even when they don't yet deserve that protection or understanding.